Yeah, that's me, 2 years old. You know, Mom and Dad took us to Beal Gardens at Michigan State even before we were born. Thousands of flowers, naps, dates, tans, workouts, history class, cramming for finals. I spent practically a lifetime here. And now, years later, I have a chance to learn the history of Beal Gardens.
Action.
Hi everyone, my name is Alan Prather. I am the interim director of the Beal Botanical Garden here on Michigan State University's lovely campus. The Beal Botanical Garden occupies about 8 acres right in the heart of campus near the historic oval on campus. It's located next to IM Circle and the library. We manage the property from the library pedestrian bridge all the way to Beal Street along the Red Cedar River, again right in the heart of campus. Today, the Historical Society of Greater Lansing is here for a tour, and the tour is going to be led by our history intern, Bill Hodgkins. The tour is focused on the 150 years of Beal Botanical Gardens. As our anniversary celebration this year, we're doing stuff all summer, and it will highlight, cap at the end with a party on September 13th.
Going on, you know, with the seeds.
The seeds? Yeah, the Beal seed experiment has started since 1878, 79, so roughly almost 150 years, 45 years.
Do you know how many jars are left? A few, not
5, 4,
yeah.
So it's wrapping up,
It's wrapping up.
but not for a while because now they're digging up it every 20 years, so it's still got some life in it. So basically the seed experiment was just an experiment Beal started to kind of test the likelihood of seeds, of how long they could survive without sunlight or natural elements. So he buried 20 bottles of large amounts of seeds underground, to kind of just digging them up every 5 years. And then that was changed to 10 years, and now it's changed to 20 years to kind of just see what seeds survive and what kind of information we can learn from that. And so that's kind of what the seed experience is about. So far there's only one surviving seed that is still in all the bottles. It's kind of, pardon me, I'm not too much of a plant person, but it's the moth mullein. Moth mullein. So it's kind of our symbol of the garden right now. So that's the Beal seed experiment. Beal Garden is almost as old as the university itself, and the university started 1855, first land grant college in the country. It's had this kind of position that's flaunted around for years. And with that, we also, Beal Garden is the oldest continuously operated garden in the country as well. So that's another kind of thing we hold as MSU, and especially here at Beal Garden. So Beal Garden was a project started by Professor Beal. He's kind of this famous professor here that we revere and we respect. He was the first botany professor here at MSU. He grew up in southern Michigan in 1833, and he grew up in this this kind of rural area where he found his passion and love for the study of plants and botany. He went to school in Harvard, where he studied under the famous botanist Asa Gray, and through there he learned even more love for botanical gardens and how necessary they are for education. Because how he was educated at Harvard was mostly through textbook learning and very hands-off learning. So Beal was frustrated with this, with his how he grew up in a rural countryside of Michigan, and he always had this hands-on approach when the study of plants. And so he wanted to kind of give that to his students once he was hired at Michigan State University, which was then called the Michigan Agricultural College at the time. And so when he was hired, he immediately stated the need for a botanical garden because he wanted to provide his students with that. Thank you. So, and then the problem he ran into was that the university was still growing. It didn't have a lot of funds, and so this garden would have taken over $10,000 or $20,000 to fund, and that they estimated that would have taken anywhere from 10 to 30 years. Beal, who was already kind of older at this point, did not want to wait that long and wanted to immediately kind of have his students be able to learn about plants. His teaching philosophy was about observation and experimentation. And so with that, in 1873, he acquired 140 species of grasses, clovers, and weeds and planted them over here in Sleepy Hollow. This was the start of the garden. This area looked very different than it does today. You can imagine it was a grid formation, kind of a traditional garden format, and there was a stream that ran through the middle of it and continued into our garden that is still present today. So with that, Beal, he was happy for this garden, but he still wanted more. This only could provide so much space. He wanted to grow even more, have a larger collection, and another thing he wanted was that this was during the Industrial Revolution, and so with that, farming was on the rise, and as a result, our native Michigan plants were being pushed into remote areas such as swamps. And so, as such, some people saw plants in this garden that they've never seen in their entire life. Beal wanted to continue this conservation and preservation of our Michigan native plants as one of his main goals when he eventually started planting over here in this floodplain of the Red Cedar River. This area behind you is where the formal Beal Garden would be established in 1877. This area used to look like this. It used to be a very heavily wildered area. They did do some land clearing in this area to eventually plant in the garden. This area when it would be first planted, it would be known as the Wild Garden because it was such a semi-formal garden. It was built into this wilderness area, into this floodplain of the Red Cedar River. Beal thought this was a big strength of the garden because it was occupied land that he knew the university would never want to occupy. Another thing is that the MSU library used to be made up of many different buildings, one of which was an old greenhouse that the botany department occupied, and they grew their own plants in. So another thing, it was also for convenience for himself. It was occupied next to the original garden and also next to his workstation pretty much. So it was a win-win for him. And with that, that's Sleepy Hollow and the founding of the garden. We'll move a little bit and we'll talk about the Wild Garden.
Sorry, I'm right in your way.
You're fine.
The reason I pulled you over here is because this is kind of where the garden started in this area, the modern Beal Garden. So the next photo Jenna will show you is kind of the old greenhouse area that basically we're standing in right now, as well as some of the early plant beds that occupied Beal Garden as well. So how Beal Garden was organized, Beal classified it as wards. So how wards worked was it was different plant families were all put in these semi-formal plant beds that made up the Wild Garden, and it was just a big cluster that kind of was a bunch of circles, miscellaneous shapes that filled in this classical garden that kind of filled its way to the semi-formalness of this garden. So, and then Jenna will show you the next photo. This is Beal Garden. This was an old postcard that was made in the 1890s that showed off the beauty and aesthetic appeal of the Beal Botanical Garden. At the time, Beal didn't call it the Beal Botanical Garden. He wasn't that self-centered. He simply called it the Botanic Garden. Students called it the Wild Garden. It eventually got the nickname of the Sunken Garden because it is a lower plane compared to the rest of the areas next to it. This name didn't stick, of course. Eventually, when Beal passed away in 1924, the college honored him by giving the garden the name the Beal Botanical Garden. Talking about the garden more formally, This space was occupied of many different aquatic areas, ponds, bogs, and of course the river that ran through the middle of the garden. So, talking about the river, the garden used to be made up of comprising of 6 different wooden bridges. There was a ravine that ran from, as I mentioned earlier, Sleepy Hollow, ran down the middle of Beal Garden. In this ravine was the river stream that eventually went into the Red Cedar River. This was a key feature of the garden. It made travel in the garden a little bit more difficult, but it added to this kind of theme of semi-formalness. This was talking about the ravine and the stream. This was both a blessing for the garden and a curse for the garden as well. In the 1890s, there was a lot of pollution recorded in this stream that ran from the city of East Lansing into this stream, into the bogs of Beal Garden. Beal reported that because of this pollution, plant life could no longer grow in these bogs, taking out many of our aquatic plant life. I think there's many different theories for how this could happen. Obviously, the city of East Lansing was growing at the time, and with that, runoff and just simple pollution from there occurred. There's also a lot of farms in the early agriculture college, so fertilizer ran off into the stream as well. And then also horses occupied the spot as well. There was a stable on campus, as well as people rode horses into campus at the time versus cars. And so those horses needed to relieve themselves, and that ran into the stream as well and into Beal Botanical Garden. So it was this beautiful spot with many different aquatic areas, but it was also easily polluted, and back in the day, this was hard for them to clean up. Basically sewage, how the early East Lansing, before they had the formal sewage system established in the 1920s, it was kind of sank this way towards the Red Cedar River. With that, the aquatic areas, that was a key feature of Beal Garden that you'll notice is mostly gone today, which we'll talk about when we get to that. But back to Beal in his era, when he planted here, his first plant he planted was in the southeast of this greenhouse that we're standing in right now. So it would be in this area looking to your right. This is where we first started this garden. How this garden was built up so fast. It started as a garden of 300 different perennially flowering plants. Was that Beal personally went out into these remote areas to gather our native Michigan plants. He worked with students. This was a large student project early on in the campus's history, where we gathered the plants and formed this garden, as well as this was part of the International Seed Exchange, where Beal talked with directors of the Kew Gardens in London, England, as well as the Morton Arboretum at Harvard University. So Beal had his connections that was able to help the garden grow as well. Speaking of those connections, that's how we're able to have such a large international plant collection. So with that, we're going to go into the garden and we're going to talk a bit more about the plants in particular. So I kind of wanted to go to this area because we're going to talk about some of our international plants. This tree behind you is the amber cork tree. This is the ginkgo tree to over here, and at the front of our garden is our katsura tree. These are all East Asian trees that came to the garden as part of the International Seed Exchange. People ask me, how did these come to the garden? It's kind of a mystery a little bit. There's multiple stories. I think one of the most fair stories and to kind of assume is that this was all part of Beal making connections with other professors around the world. It's important to note that these were all white professors from working in international countries. This was part of a semi-colonial system that we should kind of look at. That we'll kind of talk about this area a little bit more. This is a now defunct pond of the garden. This was our northern pond that was a little bit smaller than our southern pond that still exists today. And it's funny to note that this pond occupies the space that our famous Beal pineapple does today.
Pineapple?
Pineapple. For some reason, when MSU does tours for new students, one of the only things they say about the Beal Botanical Garden is they have a pineapple. It's a little frustrating because we have so much history, so much other plants, but you know, the pineapple, it's very cool. It grows in Michigan, so.
Where's the pineapple?
It's this plant bed kind of behind here, the pineapple.
You're kidding me. That's a real pineapple?
Yep.
Does it fruit? Ever? Some apples down there too.
Yeah.
Cool, okay.
The next area we'll kind of talk about, this is a famous area of Beal Botanical Garden. This is an entryway to a lot of other parts of campus. This is a lot of the people's first thing when they see Beal Garden. So this was an old picture taken for a postcard. It kind of shows what the pond looked like. You can kind of see, interestingly enough, that we used to have paved paths in the garden, and all the paths were lined with stone. These also divided the wards of the garden, which eventually did become formal plant beds, as you see today. I believe we have at least 4 full-time staff here. We hire a couple different students. I think we have 5 or 6 different students this summer. And we also work with a large group of volunteers who help maintain the garden as well. So it's a big fluctuating group, and we always appreciate the help of students and volunteers. They're critical to maintaining the garden. So the next photo is the same pond, kind of taken from a different angle. Kind of see the old shed that we worked with back in the day. It was a funny story about this shed. One of the old gardeners in an interview said that this was way too small. You could hardly fit any of the gardening equipment in, and the door didn't lock. I think it's either the early 1900s, maybe the early 1910s. So it's kind of this turn of the century era. The 1900s and the 1910s, these were 2 kind of stabilizing decades for Beal Garden. The 1900s were Beal's last years here at MSU. He retired in 1910 to eventually pursue his retirement. When Beal retired, he grew the garden substantially. So it started off as a third of an acre, and it grew to 2 acres, and it grew from 300 plants to 2,100 different plant species in the garden.
That's after you retired?
That's after he retired. So this was one of his major projects. This was something he was most proud of his legacy here at MSU. This is, as you can see, was the final garden in his retirement. This was 1895. So even though this was kind of before he considered retirement, this is kind of like the growth. He stopped kind of expanding the garden afterwards, and he worked on kind of keeping the garden afloat. Because the garden ran into many different problems. Some of the plants he brought in had short lifespans because it was tough conditions bringing all these kind of tropical plants into Michigan. It's not the good environment to grow them. This area often has flooding issues as well, so that would also take out many different plant beds. And also, he was mostly working on this by himself with the help of students, so it was hard to maintain every single plant bed. He did stop his expansion in the 1895 and eventually just focused on growing the garden as is and kind of using the garden as a living laboratory for classes around campus. It floods every so often, mostly due to spring showers. Recently it's flooded. This past spring, the red cedar actually flooded all the way up to our weed beds, so a large chunk of it was underwater. This is a floodplain of the Red Cedar River, so flooding is constant here. It's something that we have to deal with constantly. So this is the last photo we'll talk about Beal's era. This is kind of taken from this gazebo spot behind you. It's a good lookout spot for where you can kind of see the whole garden, which, as you can see in this photo, this was the wild garden, Beal's garden, at its height in the 1900s. You can kind of see how all these plant beds, it wasn't so formally kind of laid out, it occupied the whole space.
So when you say it didn't grow anymore after the 1910s, that's acreage? But
Yes.
The number of plants kept...
Yeah. So eventually it did get up to at least 4,000 different plants, but then that was too expansive of a collection, and a lot of it was invasive plants. So eventually it was lowered back down to 2,000 again. This is a good kind of number for us to work with. When I said that the garden stopped growing, I was basically saying I meant in acreage, so in size, but the number of plants still constantly grew over time. Eventually the garden, after Beal, would go up to 4,000 different plant species, but this was too large of a number of species. We couldn't fit that in the garden. A lot of it was invasive species that was dangerous to our environment, so we took those out, and so now we're back to about 2,000 different species of plants.
Bill, a couple people have asked what the building is in this photo. The white building over here.
So I was asked what this building, this white building over here, so this was the old chemistry building that occupied a spot on where the library sits. This was our chemistry building for quite some time, but in the 1950s, when the MSU library was built, they took out the chemistry building, the greenhouse in the earlier photo, as well as the old Wells Hall. So Beal retired in 1910, and as a result, the garden had to find new management. This was kind of difficult at the time because they replaced Beal with the equally renowned professor Ernest Bessey. Bessey had to basically bring the Department of Botany back up to the same speed as it was with Beal, and he had some difficulty with this early on. So one of the projects of the Botany Department was the management of Beal Garden, and so he put the garden under marked time, which basically means that nothing additionally was done to Beal Garden. There was not any work done to Beal Garden. It was kind of just left to the devices of MSU students. So eventually they did hire a guy named Johannes Uphoff in 1912. He was a Dutch botanist who came to the US for work, and he kind of managed the garden a little bit for that year, but he left the same year because he was hired at the University of Arizona for more money. So he left the same year he was hired. So the garden was once again placed under marked time. And then that kind of leads into 1914, which was a big monumental year for the garden. Firstly, I was asked about how everything was eventually drained out of Beal Garden. This happened in 1914. So the pollution racked up so much in Beal Garden that campus decided it was time to do something about it. So all the bogs and ponds were drained in the garden, as well as the ravine that ran through the middle of the garden was filled with dirt. So the stream was now underground, and the only pond we were left with was this one behind me. Another thing that happened in 1914 was the hiring of Professor Henry Darlington. Darlington would finally be a successor to Beal. The two of them met, and Beal was very excited for Darlington. Darlington had very little experience managing botanical garden, but with Beal's mentoring while he was still alive, he eventually Darlington picked up the experience and was a good manager and director of Beal Botanical Garden. One of the things he mentioned early on in 1917 was 3 different problems the garden had. The first being that staffing. He was working by himself with the occasional hiring of students. While he appreciated the help of students, this was not enough labor to formally manage the garden. Another thing he mentioned was that because he's one man, he can't keep up with the needs of the plant beds. Many plants were dying during this time period, and many of the plant beds were left empty sometimes. He couldn't find the plant materials. He had very little funding to buy new plants, so he would state that it was very unattractive to have visitors come into the botanical garden and they see very little plants, as you can imagine. A third thing, speaking of that, was at some point he lost permission to use the greenhouse that Beal had used for many years, and this was being used by the horticulture department, and so he had no place to store his plants for the winter. So as a result, during the winter that came, a lot of plants died in the garden, and he had to kind of get even more plants eventually. This eventually would be addressed in 1925 when the college let him hire a new gardener. This was, he hired a man named Chapman from the Kew Gardens. Chapman has an interesting story where he was a trainee at the Kew Garden School, but then World War I broke out, and so he was drafted into the military, where he fought in Africa and the Middle East, and then he served as the horticulturalist of Egypt under Lawrence of Arabia. So eventually he went back to England after his time there was done, and then he wanted to find new work, and he did not want to work in England. He wanted to go abroad, so eventually he went to the US, where he was hired as the head gardener of the Beal Botanical Garden in 1925. So of that, Chapman was now a lot more passionate about his job, a lot less stressed out about his job, and it made his job here easier. I've read in a report that he made, it was kind of funny to me that he finally let photographers take pictures of Beal Garden, and starting with Chapman's hiring, because he thought that Beal Garden did not look pretty enough, and he did not want his reputation to be tarnished by having those photos taken of the garden without Chapman's help. So another thing with Chapman hired, he started being a little bit more ambitious with his directorship. He sent out a questionnaire to many botanical gardens across the country and some around the world about what it means, what does it take to manage a Beal Botanical Garden, botanical gardens, and arboretums. So eventually, with that feedback he got from the questionnaire, he designed a new expansion plan that is this. So in this expansion plan, you can kind of see Beal's Botanical Garden, where it reached, as well as what kind of things he was looking for in his expansion. That's where you kind of see this fragmentation of what is the garden, what is our identity. Where with Chapman, he was more in favor of expansion, grow our collection, have the largest garden possible. Whereas with Phillips, he was more of Beal wanted to preserve our Michigan native plants, so that's what we should be doing rather than pulling in all these international plants, as well as focusing more on perennial plants and not being such a land grab towards the river when we know that the river floods and all those plant beds will be taken out in the expansion. So because of this, the Board of Trustees took the side of Phillips, and as a result, Darlington was discredited and he was let go of his position at the Beal Botanical Garden. This entered another kind of rough transitional period for the garden in the 1930s, where Chapman, who was the head gardener, was now the director of the garden, and he ran into some new problems where he was once again now understaffed. He didn't have the resources or the people to help manage the garden, as well as he was giving a new task where he was given the greenhouse once again, but as a result he needs to do more duties such as prepare flower arrangements for meetings on campus. Ernest Bessie thought that this was ridiculous and this was laughable that our head gardener had to do this at Beal Garden instead of attending to the needs of Beal Garden. But the university, of course, did not listen to him, and that's something we had to deal with for the next 10 to 20 years. But Chapman still did his best to manage the garden. This was a postcard taken in the early 1940s to kind of still show this pond area. It was still a very beautified area, and MSU students would still come and visit and just use the garden as a relaxation spot, as a wellness spot, as an education spot. They used it for whatever they wanted to. So Chapman still managed the garden, but he then, with all this new duties he had to take on, such as arranging flower decorations, he also pulled on a new duty he wanted, which was going to many different garden clubs across the state and kind of being this figurehead, have the Beal Garden be this central hub for garden clubs across the state. And so with that, he kind of built this network that where he would manage the garden. He'd also bring garden clubs. They would appreciate Beal Garden. They would donate to Beal Garden, and it was this also an educational thing for them, because he would go to their garden clubs and give lectures on botany and horticulture. This was something him and the new botany department thought would be good for Beal Garden, and they want to continue this function. So they eventually, in 1946, they went to the new president, President Hanna, to kind of talk about the new role of Beal Garden. They wanted to take out this deal they had where they had to make flower arrangements, because this is something the horticulture department should be doing, not the botany department, as well as talking about how he should continue this job of going to garden clubs across the country. This is where Hanna kind of put his foot down. He hated this arrangement that Chapman was doing, where he was kind of neglecting the educational function of the garden in favor of being this kind of figurehead for garden clubs across the state. And he wanted to kind of return to the Beal time of having the garden being a living laboratory rather than being this pretty spot on campus that people would visit. And so as a result, Chapman would be relieved of his duties, and then the garden would be pulled away from the botany department into this new department he created called the Campus Park and Planning. This department would be focused on the preservation of the naturalness and natural beauty of MSU. This department knew that Beal Garden was its educational function and it should return to that. And so with that, we can go over to a new area where we can I can better talk about what they planned for this expansion in the 1950s. So when the Campus Park and Planning Department came together, they had a couple different goals when they wanted to redesign Beal Garden. The first being return to educational Michigan native plants. They also want to improve mobility through Beal Garden versus the kind of winding paths that kind of made up Beal Garden at the time, as well as they wanted to make it easier to manage and clean. So with that, they also had to balance this new growing botany thing called educational botany, which focused on the human uses of plants. And so this was a new kind of class that MSU was making. And so with that, they divided the garden into two sections. Everything on this side of the sidewalk, this is the systematic section. The systematic section was kind of organized how Beal Garden used to be. This was arranged based on plant families that you would find in a botany textbook. So it'd be starting at the staircase, going forward. It's like flipping through a textbook, go from one family to the next and kind of see how plants evolved over time and how they grew. Everything to my right, your left, is the economic section, thank you. So this section would be focused on human uses of plants. So there would be a weed section, there would be a vegetable section, there would be a herb section, there would be a dye section. Any way how humans use plants, they put it in this economic section. And so this is how Beal Garden still is today. They designed this in the 1950s, and it's still being used in 2022. 23? My bad. So there's also some new developments during this time. In In 1955, they hired a new curator for the garden. His name was George Parmalee. He was an expert in trees, as well he was knowledgeable in plants. He wanted to create a new plant label that you would see in the garden. This would be more museum-focused plant labeling system, where you get to learn what the plant is, you get to kind of know where it's from, you get to get some knowledgeable facts. And so that's kind of the structure of our plant labels today. Personally, being not in the botany department, I think he didn't do too great of a job of making it accessible to non-botany experts. And so, but I think it's a good spot of how the garden grew, and it was a good direction of where it was going, making the garden more for everyone versus just botany students. Another fun story about those plant labels. So before I go on to that, this is kind of how they looked in the 1960s. It was, they had this new steel plant label on top, but they also used the classic wooden stakes in the garden for those labels. This was something that Beal had during his time, and they just finally evolved those labels into something more kind of advanced and knowledgeable. The garden still ran into some issues with those labels, specifically the wooden stakes that they decided to keep. Those wooden stakes would easily erode because they were wood versus steel, and they would break down, cause the labels to break. Students would also commonly steal the labels, as well as there was sometimes pests such as squirrels, rabbits, and our biggest enemy of Beal Garden, the muskrats, would come in and they would eat the labels sometimes. So that was something we had to accommodate. And also, they did not do well with flooding, specifically or by the riverside. So in 1975, there was massive flood that hit the city of Lansing. And as a result, Beal Garden, being right next to the river, was very vulnerable to that. We'll talk about that when Jenna can show the photo. So when the flooding hit, the red cedar engulfed the whole garden, going all the way to our northern staircase. There were reports that the garden was under 2 to 3 feet of water. This was the biggest flooding in Beal Garden's history. We've never had anything like this since or before. But the funny story that came with this flooding was that all of our wooden labels were lifted out of the ground, and they went sailing down the Red Cedar River. So in order to they had to retrieve the labels, right? So they pulled out a rowboat, a wooden rowboat from I don't know where, and they sailed that rowboat down the Red Cedar River and picked up all the wooden stakes, the labels that were sailing down. It was a very kind of comical scene, as you can imagine, but being a Beal Garden employee, it would probably be horrifying as well, that all your hard work is sailing down the river. So that's a kind of funny yet tragic story of our labeling system. And eventually that did change in the 1990s, where the wooden stakes were eventually taken out in favor of the new steel stakes. The labeling system also kind of changed. We had some experts in poison plants that were hired, and so some of those labels were changed as knowledge of these plants changed. We became more educated, and so with that we changed a lot of our labels to kind of keep up with the current knowledge. There's also some new changes that happened in the garden. There were some new additions to the garden. We had Sleepy Hollow had fallen out of our hands, but in the 1960s, Sleepy Hollow was eventually came back into the garden, and that spot has become not as much as an educational spot, but kind of a recreational spot, as you guys saw today. We have a couple new sections as well. We have our non-flowering vascular plants, which make up our southwest area, kind of behind the IM building. We have a new gold deer daylily section, which we passed by when we looked at the kind of greenhouse spot. And as well as we're kind of becoming more and more knowledgeable of our plant trees around campus and in the garden. We now are the recorders of the campus arboretum, as we call it, where if you go to our website, you can learn about any tree on campus. You can learn about what it's called. If you need help identifying what trees are, you can go to our website. You can also, some of the trees, and that you can also learn the dates of when they were first planted. One of the trees, for example, we passed by are Norway spruces that they actually predated Beal Garden. So they were planted about 300 years ago in this spot. And so that's when people ask me what's the oldest plant in Beal Garden, we have our Norway spruces. This is another section that was added in 2017. This is our Asian collection. This tree was given to us in the 1950s. This is the Dawn Redwood, and as a result, we kind of built out a new section around it. This was a East Asian plant as well, and so with that, we kind of built in this new section that focused on East Asia. That's kind of, if you'll notice on our map at the front of the garden, a lot of the hillsides are dedicated to regions of the state or the world. That kind of happened unintentionally because we noticed, the gardeners back in the day noticed that, oh, we have a lot of European plants here, let's make this the European section. Or we have a lot of southwestern plants in this section, let's make this the Southwest USA section. So that happened as a coincidence. It used to be known as the economic section, so maybe there was some intention there, but over time it was kind of forgotten, but it came back again. So that's kind of bringing us up to modern time. We're working on some new projects as well. We're kind of working on the red cedar restoration, which over time, the red cedar, if you look at the riverbanks, they've kind of become very eroded and they're house to many different invasive species. So being good custodians of the Red Cedar River, we want to kind of help clean up and fix the Red Cedar River. We're pulling out many different invasive plants such as honeysuckle and ficaria, as well as we're kind of trying to mind the area to kind of kind of protect the area from foot traffic, kind of prevent erosion from building out. We're also kind of focusing newly on the wellness feature of the garden. This was something that we noticed all the way back in Beal's time, where it wasn't just a place for students to come visit. It was also not just a place for botany students to come visit. It was also a place for anyone on MSU or anyone in East Lansing to come visit and just have a nice spot to relax, maybe learn something about plants, and just kind of be at peace with yourself. So we're embracing this new thing. And maybe if you notice around Beal Garden, we have this new thing called Nurture Root Stations. They're called rooting stations, where you can go and kind of be at peace with yourself, find wellness in yourself through many different methods. You can listen to music, you can read poetry, or you can have some meditation. So that's something newly we're focusing on, kind of taking this new wellness approach. So we're also working on a new part of the garden. We kind of didn't walk all the way towards it, but we have a new pollinator garden that we're working on for the 100th and 50th anniversary. These are all Michigan native plants that are all focused on being pollinating plants. So this is something we're working on. Hopefully this will be a new feature of Beal Garden going forward. That's kind of everything up to today. So that's kind of brings us to an end. Thank you for coming out to Beal Garden. Appreciate you guys all being here, learning about our 150th anniversary.